Hello again. Welcome to week two. I hope you enjoyed the opening week and reading about alternate storylines and how our stories have such a profound effect on us and our lives in the sense of how we interpret our stories and how much ownership we feel we have in those stories. And the one of the amazing things about narrative is it helps us to realize that we are in very profound ways the authors of our own stories, even when our stories are not even chapters of our stories that are not very supportive or nurturing, or even could be quite horrific. It still is really important for our psyche and our emotional and physical health and wellness to recognize that we have some influence over how those events in our lives, in story or chapters of our lives, how those affect us, and that's really the heart of narrative. We talked about this last week a little bit. I talked about the hopefulness of narrative in the sense that it's a constructionist view of reality, and I wanted to mention that, go into a little bit more on that before we go right into week two here. But there are really two kinds of reality. I don't want to imply that there isn't some fixed, rigid aspects to reality. For example, if there's an accident, say there's an automobile accident, then that accident's real. You can't. That's not socially constructed through interactions or relationships, and if people are injured in that accident, their injuries are real. The part of reality that we're talking about being constructed or co-constructed is the how we respond to that and our interpretation of that and how it impacts us long term in terms of our overall emotional health and wellness and well-being. And so those aspects of reality are what constructionists and constructivist folks believe, and I'm in that camp. Believe we can change. That's the beauty. That's the empowering, hopeful nature of that perspective. And since narrative is built on that perspective, that's why I find narrative to be so healing and so empowering. As we look at our own stories and our own lives, and we begin to re-narrate and reconstruct, re-author some of those in terms of how we've internalized them, it can have a profound effect. There are parts of my own earlier childhood, for example, that I interpreted in a very distinctive way that was a negative way, and it had a far-reaching impact on me for many years into my early adulthood. And it wasn't until actually around age 30 when I had a chance to work with somebody who had blended sort of narrative and psychoanalytic together that I actually had this huge breakthrough in my own life. And it was, by the way, also the turning point that I shifted my life path and moved into social work and toward this kind of work. So it has a very special spot in my own life story. So let's look at the first real level of narrative, which is an important level, and it's under the heading here of externalization. So in week two, we're going to one of the things that constructivists and constructionist perspectives do, particularly being narrative and solution-oriented, solution-focused therapy, is help people to realize that we're not our problems, right? We're more than that. It's kind of like looking at someone with a broken leg and saying, Oh, there they go. That's the broken leg person. Well, the broken leg person's got a lot more to them than the broken leg, right? So separating ourselves some from the fact that we are much more than whatever it is that's distressing us or causing issues in our lives, including severe and horrific trauma that's impacting us or has impacted us. Um, there's obviously, if somebody's currently in a life-threatening situation or a harmful or abusive situation, then we deal with that first, and you folks know that. As we move then and we get to safety, can begin narrative work and look at so how do we interpret what's happening or happened to us? And the first step of this is this really cool thing that narrative calls externalization. And whoops, sorry, take myself right out of the picture. I was just trying to give you guys a little more clear screen there without me blocking it. So in week two, we'll look at this notion of externalization, and how does that come into play? You'll also continue your readings in the Burek Weiss book, which I didn't really talk about last week, but this other text, how do we get that straight? There we go. um, I really hope you enjoy this text. Sort of read it, savor it. You're going to have a chapter most weeks to read. I would try to do that when you have time, to really relax. I know that's hard to find when you're in grad school and raising families, and a lot of people are working, and it's just life's going on. But those chapters are not that long, and they're really written in a narrative, conversational way. There's some really special. Each one has I think, a real special message. So I would encourage you to try and find some nice time for those. This week you'll look at a case study that's a composite of a young fellow that I worked with, and really challenging young man who was facing some significant challenges, and really responded in amazing ways to narrative over a series of meetings together. So you'll get a chance to work with Chris, and begin to apply this first layer of narrative, which is externalization. So in externalization, what's happening is we're helping people. We almost always will come in to see if you finally work up the courage and the nerve to go see a counselor for some kind of issue, and by the time you do, most of us have really internalized that. For me, my initial interaction with counseling was around depression and actually some suicidal ideation, and it, so you've really internalized that. You go in and you talk in terms of my depression, and I don't know, I'm just my depression just consumes me. I've had it for a while. It's a part of me. And narrative's going to help us to shift our relationship with that. And my depression's going to become, at least in the simplest terms, the depression. So, try saying that for a minute to yourself. Say, my depression. I'll wait and give you. So, my depression. And say that again. My depression. Now shift and say, the depression. One more time. The depression. Do you feel a little bit of a shift there? Most people do, and so some of us it takes a little longer than others, but and this is just the very, very beginning of narrative. Some people mistake narrative for being this sort of simplistic. It's talk therapy. We talk through some things. We talk about a person's story. And I don't mean to diminish that. There's certainly some value in that. But narrative is much more than just telling stories. It's really, it's really looking at the meaning behind those stories and how we interpret those and how that interpretation and meaning affects how we feel, how we think, how we feel, how we live our lives. And so in this first layer of narrative, this is a super important layer where we're helping narrative. We don't do a lot with someone from a narrative perspective until they've externalized the source of their distress in their lives. So if it's depression, we externalize that. If it's anxiety, we externalize that. If it's response to trauma and other forms of response and coping with trauma, adapting to trauma, then we'll externalize that. So you'll practice that this week, and it sounds really simple on the surface, but to be honest, it's one of these things that has to be. The timing has to be right, it has to be genuine, and the externalization has to come from the other person. It has to come from the client. It can't come from the therapist. If we externalize for someone, they won't get the healing benefit of that, and it's not going to make sense and it's not going to work. So I hope you enjoy this week. I hope you can make sense out of the notion of separating ourselves from our problems in order to the purpose of, and the reason for that is so that we can then renegotiate our relationship with those issues. And that's where the real healing begins. So I wish you another good week, and hope you enjoy the readings and this opportunity to really get in there and experiment with externalization. Couple of good videos, I think. One that's really, running with narrative ideas will give you an introduction to narrative, and then the video on talking about what matters rather than what is the matter is a really nice way to reposition and separate some from problems so we can renegotiate. It's also extremely trauma-informed way of engaging folks. So enjoy, and I will see you again in week 3.